I'm not sure if everybody can hear me, but I think we can start. I want to welcome everybody to the Platform from Electromobility's second webinar on grid infrastructure. And my name is Fabian Sperker. I'm working for the NGO Transport Environment, Europe's leading clean transport NGO. And I'm leading on TNE's work on charging infrastructure, but also on grids and EV integration. A word to the Platform for Electromobility. The Platform for Electromobility is a coalition of industry associations, NGOs, that all work together for the development of a sustainable transport sector across all modes in Europe. Last week, we had our first webinar, and we talked about how e-mobility can be integrated as smooth as possible into the grid. Today, we want to focus on a specific mode of transport, namely road transport, and even more specific on heavy-duty vehicles and how they will affect the grid and what can be done to integrate them as smoothly as possible into the European power grids. We have today, we will focus on this topic from three angles. First of all, how assessing the existing grid capacity as well as the future needs of HDV charging infrastructure can help to inform grid planning. Then we want to also look at how a European data framework could look like that would facilitate smooth logistic operations. And last but not least, we also want to look at how or what the costs will be of the build of megawatt charging across Europe. And I'm happy to have four speakers here today with me. We have Diego Carvajal, who's working for the International Copper Association, Koen Noyens, who works for the CPO Mailand, that focuses mostly or exclusively on HDV charging. And we have Julia Hildemeyer, who works for the Regulatory Assistant Project. And last but not least, we also have with us today Kai Tullius from the Commission's DG Move, who knows the ins and outs of the AFIR, the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure regulations. So how are we going to do this today? So we have 45 minutes, and each of our platform speakers, so Diego, Kai, and Julia, will have about 10 minutes. I will ask them questions, they will answer. And then finally, Kai will be able to give an intervention after each speaker. Or maybe he's on the screen now. Maybe you want to just briefly introduce yourself.
Oh, I didn't know. Yes, Kai Tullius, DG Move. I'm responsible overall for the regulation alternative fuels infrastructure, and happy to be here.
Thank you, Kai. So then I would like to turn to our first speaker. Diego, are you here?
Yes.
Yes.
Good morning,
hello.
Everyone.
Good morning. Good morning, Diego. Diego works for the International Copper Association, and the International Copper Association is Europe's leading advocate for the copper industry and all companies across the copper value chains, from mining, smelting to refining and recycling. And Diego represents the International Copper Association, is the leading expert on electromobility and batteries. And with him, we want to focus on, like the assessment of the grids and what future charging needs HDVs will pose to the grid. So, Diego, can you tell us how the assessment of the existing grid capacity, as well as the future charging needs stemming from battery electric trucks, but also coaches and buses, is crucial for a smooth deployment of charging infrastructure, be it fast megawatt charging, but also private charging in depots?
Yes, of course. First, it's important to have in mind that trucks are the road segment with highest CO2 emissions in EU, approximately or about 28% of the emissions by just 2.8 of the percentage of the road vehicles. Battery trucks will soon be mainstream, mainly driven by a lower total cost of ownership and also the CO2 regulations. German truck OEMs think that the market share of battery trucks in Germany by 2030 will reach 58%. Urban and regional delivery trucks will mostly recharge at depots, at private infrastructure. Long haul will also need megawatt charging systems and high power chargers along highways. The lack of enough capacity of the electricity grid is already slowing down the shift to battery trucks in a number of regions in Europe. It could also undermine the trajectory defined by the CO2 standards. So, given the long lead times to reinforce grids, marketing battery trucks and reinforcing grids should move in parallel. And two main action points on this regard. First one is to assess and eventually reinforce electricity grids where recharging will likely take place. And second, is necessary to update regulations to allow grid operators to reinforce grids in advance under the regulator supervision.
Thank you, Diego, for this. Maybe a follow-up question and also an extension of the first question. So, by the end of this year, member states, or the end of this year or beginning of next year, need to develop national deployment plans and line out how they want to achieve the AFIR targets, or in some cases maybe go beyond. And what do you think? How can this deployment plans help to ensure timely grid reinforcement or expansion? And how can they help to attract necessary public but also private investments?
I think that we have good news on that respect. Why? Because we already know, where trucks most likely will be recharged. Is where trucks currently stop. So ASEA made a map across Europe of where trucks currently stop. Based on GPS logs of 140,000 trucks during 1 year across Europe, the priority should be on 10% of the locations accounting for 50% of the stops, of the total number of stops. And also, ASEA has identified the annual maximum number of simultaneous trucks by location. That is, in our view, the best proxy to know what is the power that we are going to need from the grid. So we suggest to create a national task force, a national group, within the current efforts to implement AFIR, to identify those grid reinforcements and implement them. Key participants of these groups will be national agencies, truck manufacturers, and grid operators. It'd be important to include in this assessment also the private infrastructure depots, because urban and regional delivery will recharge mostly at that places. Also, the scope of AFIR is only public infrastructure, so it will be important also to consider in this work the private one. The most scarce resource is time rather than money. For example, France, Enedis, and several truck manufacturers estimated that to have the grid ready for battery trucks by 2035 will cost around 57 million euros, while it will take years to implement the reinforcements needed. So, in our view, it's urgent to start as soon as possible with this assessment of the grid and allowing DSOs to reinforce in advance. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. I forgot to mention in the beginning that, of course, our audience can ask questions at any time, and you just put it in the chat, and then I can post them to our speakers. But now I want to turn to Kai. So you heard Diego's intervention and how he, but also the platform, thinks a timely planning of charging infrastructure can help, informing grid reinforcement. Is the Commission looking at this somehow? How do you think AFIR can help, or can it be improved in the future? What do you think?
Well, I think it's clear the electricity grid is of paramount importance here for building up the recharging infrastructure that we need for heavy-duty vehicles. Recharging pools, but also huge depots will require up to 10 megawatt or even more power, and that basically means new connections actually have to be built to actually connect these recharging pools, and that is by no means easy, neither in time, but also not in money. So things need to move here. Diego said that proactive grid planning is of very big importance here. We know where the depots are basically today, which needs to be electrified over the coming years. We know the main locations for recharging pools that will also be now identified by member states under AFIR. And what we need, and here I fully agree with Diego here, is on member states level, a clear coordinated planning with all relevant actors. When planning locations for AFIR, we expect that the member states actually reach out to all actors involved and ensure that the grid is being developed as well. And we will see to which extent they will do that under the national policy frameworks, where they actually have to outline their plans on how they approach it and where the locations will be. So things are moving there. But I think we also need to go beyond that. AFIR is just basically for publicly accessible. Diego said that on the 10T. But it is much more than that. It is depots as well, and it's huge investments that we will see. I think we actually recognize that. You will actually also have seen in the Draghi report that he specifically mentioned the importance of a basically combined rollout of the grid and the infrastructure, that we cannot look at the infrastructure for recharging as something independent from the grid, but need to focus here. Commission has the grid action plan already adopted, so work is going on here. But if you look into the mission letters now, also especially to the Commissioner for Energy, Jorgensen, there's a lot about the action plan for electrification. There is a specific focus on the reinforcement of the grid to actually enable the electrification, not only in transport, in our economy. So I think we will see a lot of action by this Commission to actually really get the electricity network also ready for the shift towards electrification in all economic sectors.
Thank you. Maybe one brief follow-up question, because Diego mentioned it and it seemed quite important. Is there anything the Commission think about doing about private charging by HDVs, or is this something that you think will happen on a member state level only?
Too early to say. We will review AFIR, of course. I think the decisions under the last commission was basically not to address that. We cannot really mandate targets for the depots because it is private. It must be, we basically mandate through the CO2 standards, and for public fleets through the CVD, that basically the operators need to purchase zero emission vehicles. Or in terms of the CO2 emission performance standards, of course, the vehicle manufacturer have to sell them. So then the owners of the depots should actually decide on what their charging plans are. Do they actually build their own charging network? Will they actually have cooperations with publicly accessible charging, so to avoid basically huge investments in the infrastructure themselves, which may also be difficult with grid access? So there will be lots of decisions to be made by the companies for the specific need of the individual companies. And so this is why we've always been reluctant to come up there and mandate things for companies that might be completely over or undersized for the individual needs of the company. So there, I think subsidiarity and private initiatives are actually key, and not so much a all-knowing Brussels knowing what has to be done in a specific depot in a specific city.
All right, thanks for this answer, Kai. And then we, in the interest of time, I think we turn to our next speaker. Is Koen? Are you there? Yeah. There's
hey.
Koen. Hi, Koen.
Morning.
Let me briefly introduce you. So you work for Milence. Milence is a CPO working heavily on HDV charging infrastructure, public HDV charging infrastructure. Milence is also a joint venture of Europe's probably biggest OEMs in the HDV sector. And you are Milence head of public policy. And with you, we want to talk today about data regulatory frameworks, and how this could help to smoothen logistic operations. But we also want to talk a little bit about standards. So my first question is, how important is it to have an aligned standard for ultra high power megawatt charging? And how important, how easy is it to integrate that into regulation to ensure a smooth interoperability across Europe?
Yeah, no, exactly. We as a company, we're obviously very busy with deploying our network, and today we are working with the existing solutions that are out there, being the CCS technology, so putting in place 400 kilowatt chargers in all the public charging hubs that we deploy. But still this year we will be starting with a demonstration of the megawatt chargers. So being able to offer power starting from capacities of 700 kilowatt and above, ranging up to 1 megawatt, eventually 1.4 megawatt at this point in time. So that's something that we'll be doing. The MCS standard is going to be critical, and that's basically, if you look at the real use case of these heavy-duty vehicles, it needs to align very much with the use case of the drivers. So you need to be able to provide power in a very short period of time. So the 1 megawatt threshold is going to be very important. All the OEMs have come forward with the confirmation that they will implement this standard, which is still under development. But for us as a company, I think for the whole industry, it will be important that eventually this gets enshrined in EU law. So we expect Kai and its colleagues also in the upcoming delegated regulations somehow to start referring, hopefully at some point in time, to the standards once it's adopted by the European standardization bodies, so that from a principal legal point of view, we have that certainty that is the standard that we want to work with in Europe, but also internationally. So there's a cooperation with the international counterparts in the US in particular, So that's going to be crucial in terms of providing that certainty. But if you then look at the implementation, and that's going to be the tricky bit going forward, we are already seeing some challenges at national level with the implementation of the MCS standard. And I'm going to give 2 examples. One is in France. There is a specific technical French standard, the AFNOR 15100. It's a standard that deals with the design, the installation, the operation of low voltage electrical installations. So that particular standard, sets specific rules about safety and protection, how you need to integrate overcurrent protection devices, how you need to install certain elements, how you need to do load management. And we've come across, let's say, the first questions from technical experts about the alignment of that specific MCS standard and the French norm. So there, specific amendments will be needed in order to make sure that the MCS standard and the way we want to design and implement that standard at our hubs can be fully be compatible with that local standard. The same, and that's a second example, in Germany. I think those present here in the webinar and those that are busy in the EV charging world will know about the so-called Eichrecht rules and regulations in Germany. We will go a similar road here for MCS, how to make sure that we get, let's say, certified energy meters in MCS installations going forward, and that they can somehow are able to provide accurate measurements. So that is an aspect that we again believe will be very critical at national level to be dealt with. How to make sure that specific standard gets compliant with this standard at national level. So that's something that we see as the next step of challenges that we as companies and as industry need to deal with.
Thank you, Kuhn. Curious what Kai will say about that. But before we turn to Kai, let me ask you another question. Now more on data sharing and interoperability. I mean, how is this critical for optimizing logistic chains and charging operations for HDVs? And how can industry-wide standards for data exchange, how can they be established, and how can they improve efficiency and reliability of the overall logistics sector?
Yeah, no, very important question. I mean, we have a strong belief that in the end of the day, public charging and private charging for this segment of road transport will only work if it can rely on a proper, smooth integration into the logistics value chain. If you talk about logistics value chain, companies are operating at very thin margins. Everything needs to happen at lowest cost as possible. So in the end of the day, you wanna make sure that charging doesn't become a bottleneck or a hurdle. So that means that companies will need to get the certainty that they will be able to charge at dedicated moments in time, and that there's no queuing or waiting or no situations where there's unavailable power supply at dedicated locations. So both CPOs, fleet operators, shippers, OEMs, grid operators, they all have an interest to somehow know what's going on in their respective, domain of the value chain. We as CPOs want to know if there's traffic jams or if trucks will not be able to charge at our locations, because then we can free up some capacity and which we can inform about to the grid operator. Likewise, if our installations or if there is an outage of the grid, we want to provide signals over open data to the fleets so that they can deviate their routes and find a more cost-effective way of charging elsewhere. So making sure that we get some data sharing across the board is going to be crucial. Well, today we're dealing with a situation, there's a lot of fragmentation. So different players using different proprietary systems, different data formats. So there's no real interoperability. If you look at the whole value chain, yes, there's interoperability. If you talk about, CPMS systems, roaming on the charging side, but not across OEMs, fleets who use their own routing systems, for example, charging and on the grid side. So We will need to, as an industry, I think, come together closely, work towards open data models, look eventually to new types of standards for real-time data sharing. So being able to share real-time battery state of charge, position of vehicles, expected time of arrivals. So there are already, well, solutions being proposed, very often proprietary solutions by companies. So we see definitely a value of, well, somehow getting closer together, cooperating on specific open data standards. So that is one thing. What can regulations do here? We're not necessarily calling for new specific regulations. It's more something the EU should promote open APIs, open standards, so that there's accessibility for all types of players. That is a very important aspect. Certainly when it comes to also data that is originating from within the vehicle. So there you can actually also push certain players in the market. Last but not least, last point I want to make is indeed open access on the grid side. Diego touched upon it. We as players want to get visibility, transparency on what's going on the grid. Today in many countries, we do not have that transparency. And that actually impacts the way we roll out our network. We want to have better visibility on where available grid capacity is or where future proof grid connections will come. And there's a few examples, few good practices out there, but this can be better promoted by the EU as well.
Thank you, Koen. On that, maybe, I mean, all of this helps in understanding the charging patterns of HDVs. And can you tell us something about what's the potential of, huge charging hubs and HDVs by extension to participate in the flexibility market, and how important are time-varying tariffs?
Well, at this moment in time of the market, I mean, we haven't reached really an inflection point yet. So and we have a few hubs online, and I think our priority as a company today is also to make sure that we provide that certainty that power will be there and that logistics companies can rely on, well, a stable power supply. We will, because we don't have an answer today yet, we will need to evaluate also how charging patterns will happen. We already, of course, have 3 hubs open, and we get first data in, and we see kind of a more, well, I would say, stable charging pattern, stable across the day. So not really identifying real big peaks, but that still need to be evaluated how that goes along the way. That will depend on location, that will depend on specific use case. So once we get more granular and we develop and get more insights into this, then we will be able to evaluate much more what kind of flexibility we can provide to the energy system from, let's say, public charging hub point of view. Today we don't see a lot of value yet, again, because our role is to provide power at all times and not to, well, play with the energy, so to say. But once you get into, well, specific setups where we will connect directly with renewables and put in place battery storage, then obviously the use case can be different, and there might indeed be a relevant use case for some flexibility. This, contrary to private depots, there might be a bigger potential there.
All right, thanks for this. Now, is Kai here, so he can maybe respond to Koen's intervention, and very curious about how you see like the standardization of the megawatt charger, for instance.
Yeah, starting maybe with the easier topic, which is the megawatt charger. What we are actually planning to do, I think we said it multiple times. I mean, we want to promote interoperability. We actually mandate the standards that are available. I mean, this is the clear mandate that we have under AFIR. We are doing that. So the delegated implementing acts now on certain standards are now in the pipeline. So they will come later this year, also on data exchange of the operators. So these delegated acts are coming. Interoperability is important. We mandate it. For the megawatt charger, we can only mandate what industry agreed. Once we actually have a European standard, we can mandate it, and we will do that. I think this has always been a very, very clear statement from our side, but we rely on the standard being agreed before we can actually mandate that. And what we cannot do is write in the delegated act, once that standard is agreed, it has to be mandated from that point of view. No, we're going to have a new delegated act, then mandating that shouldn't be a big issue. So this is coming. What we also do is we close basically a loophole. Under current RFIA, every recharging point has to have at least CCS. And so that will basically ban to actually deploy a megawatt charger. So that we get rid of, so that it's actually legal to do a megawatt charging for HDV, even in the absence of a European standard. So this is what you can expect by the delegated act here. So legal certainty here for anybody who wants to do a megawatt charger, that he's still in line with the legislation. So that is coming. Yeah, issues about national rules. It is a issue that we see throughout RFIA. Many member states are very keen on having their individual rules on many little things, and we try to discourage them to do so. I cannot now comment on the specific case for the megawatt charging in France, but when, of course, the megawatt charger meets the electricity management rules, then I think it's the charging sector that needs to adopt or see also with the electricity system what needs to be done then on a local level and national level. When it comes to the German Eichrecht, that is another thing we know, that is basically for the DC charging, Germany requires very accurate measurements, which is fair enough at the end of the day, because as a user, you actually want to be relatively sure that whatever the charge point operator charges you in terms of kilowatt hours is actually properly measured and not just said, yeah, well, more or less. You likely got less, but anyways, clear measurements are important, and I think here we need harmonization. And DG GROW under the measurement regulation directive is actually working on that. It got a little bit stuck because there are lots of technical details that still need to be sorted out, but there we are working on to actually get a common European solution for DC measuring that is going to be applied throughout the Union. I think that is crucial, and it's also what industry always wanted to have. All the aspects on data I mentioned. Under RFIA, we basically mandate data to be shared by the operators of recharging and refueling stations, basically as a user information thing. Data exchange, of course, in the world of e-mobility goes ways beyond that, and it actually then also needs to include the vehicles. And I think Corinne mentioned all the important aspects here that needs to be transferred when actually want to basically ensure smooth charging. And I think you are aware under the Renewables Energy Directives, Article 20A, there is actually also an obligation now to actually on the manufacturers to share that data. And here we will be working jointly also to find common solutions here for Europe. But I think it's a thing that will actually be with us for many years to come, probably, knowing how difficult it is already to share static data on charge points, but now actually moving to mobile data on very technical issues. We have to make sure that actually common APIs are used so it's fully interoperable. This is a huge chunk of work coming up. Have to see how we actually also, in terms of structures, we'll do that. DG GROW has working groups looking into these issues already. A Sustainable Transport Forum has a group on data. So things are moving there. It's certainly something that will be with us for the next coming years, because I think it is important.
Thank you, Kai. We actually had a question from the audience, but I think in the interest of time, we will probably put that more to the end, and then we probably also have more questions to the audience. And we go to the next speaker, which is Julia Hildemeyer. Julia, hello.
Hi, hello. Good morning.
Good morning. Julia works for the regulatory assistant project, which is an independent global NGO working toward a clean, reliable, equitable, and cost-efficient energy future. And with Julia, from Julia, we would like to hear how megawatt charging, or what will be the costs of megawatt charging. But first of all, with AFIR now in place, I mean, we talked about that already, but have we done already enough to support the EV grid integration?
Yes, thanks, Fabian. So first of all, I mean, it's perhaps important to remind ourselves that the key to sort of rapid electrification of road freight is grid optimal charging. So it's really important that electric freight becomes most cost efficient, as cost efficient as it can get, to be built and to be used for fleets. You heard it, it's a low margin business, but also for the grids, and hence, because we save cost in the system for everyone, for all digital users. And the magic recipe that you've heard us say many times is smart charging, which is nothing else than making truck charging as cost efficient as it can get. And that's why it's really essential that all the policies that are in place promote directly or indirectly optimized charging, especially for trucks, because of course bigger batteries, bigger loads of the system, grid upgrades will be needed in most cases when we talk about charging hubs along the highway, especially as we approach megawatt scale. So on the policy is in place, AFIR has been an excellent starting point, especially on the heavy duty side. Also because it requires all new charging points to be able to measure and communicate consumption, which is, as we can say, the basis of smartness. But of course, it also only legislates up to the charging point. So for, let's say, optimized charging to actually happen, we have a couple of energy market rules and regulations that need to be in place. And the first and most important one is actually the price signal that arrives at where the truck charges. That can be a CPO in the case of public truck charging that we've just discussed, or at the depot in the case of private depot charging or freight center. So whoever the end electricity customer is, they need to see a price signal that reflects the actual cost of delivering the energy to the end customer. Why? Because it helps them within their given window of flexibility to charge when it's cheaper. So they can save cost, but we also save cost on the system. We fully recognize that in the case of megawatt charging, that is a challenge because the time window is very short. It's much more obvious for depot charging, where the trucks park, let's say, overnight and recharge, and have plenty of time to adapt their charging either in capacity or actually in time to charge when it's cheaper and use the grid optimally. And that's the sort of state where we want to get. That will be crucially sort of helped by implementation of the energy market reforms that we've seen finalized on European level by end of last year. And it's really critical that member states do this swiftly and ambitiously. This contains things as sort of setting the framework towards introducing more time-varying pricing. It also includes increased transparency requirements for grid operators, so we know what's going on the grid. Basically, we can plan for upgrades in the best way. We've heard from Diego about anticipatory investments that are key. We'd like to see hosting capacity maps all over Europe that show what capacity is already available for better planning, and that planning should obviously include stakeholders from the grid and from the transport sectors. There's also one last thing that can be done on a national level, and that is in tenders. And I mention that because we've just seen a very interesting tender for the build out of megawatt charging in Germany that was published a couple of days ago, which includes a few interesting features. namely help for covering demand charges, basically covering part of the cost for offering that charging, and that's a good indicator on where the problem is, because it points again to how the using of power networks is priced and how that can be improved. So we'll see lots of interesting developments there, and all of that is national ambition. But I don't want to close without saying that we're really very hopeful that on EU level we'll see a push on electrification, as Kai has mentioned. The mission letter for Commissioner Jurgensen also includes grid modernization. It includes using flexibility resources where possible for the grid, and smartly charged electric cars are nothing else than a great resource of flexibility. So there's lots more that we'll hopefully see in terms of useful support from EU level to help member states to be as ambitious as they can to put in place all conditions to make smart charging possible.
Thank you, Julia. Follow it up on the cost aspect. I mean, a couple of months ago, RUP has published a study on the costs of truck megawatt charging and also the impact megawatt charging has on the grid. Can you maybe share with us the main findings of your report?
Sure. That study is out a couple of months now, and what we did is look into what the cost would be to offer close to a megawatt charging capacity in specific border regions in Europe, where the most truck traffic crosses. And what we saw is that the cost for offering such charging will depend a lot on the grid cost, on the cost of using those power grids, where the truck charging will be. And that's actually crucial, because if we put in place time-varying network tariffs, in whichever shape or forms, this cost can be reduced because we're using the power grids more optimally. And as we speak, big capacity, that's very important. So that was proof for us that in many countries, introduction of time-varying network tariffs is really the key to help us all use the grid better. It may be electric trucks, but it may also be other types of charging, of course, other forms of consumption. So it's just a very basic condition. It's mostly on national energy regulators. But stay tuned for more research coming up from RAP in 1 or 2 months, where we actually looked into a specific grid in France, south of Paris, and we could see that different electric vehicle fleets can help shave the load peaks on a system by optimizing their charging, by putting in place smart charging. And it was really fascinating to see that smart charging in the end is a common task for all electric vehicles. So, for example, it's not just residential sort of overnight charging that we know for passenger cars. It's also workplace charging. It's definitely depot charging, which is why it should be the starting point for electrification of electric freight altogether, because that's really where the truck charges. And we could also see that to help, let's say, megawatt charging at highways, sort of when it happens during the day, and it's likely to coincide with sort of to add to system peak, it's very hard to shift this charging because we only have 30 minutes, or Kuhn will know best. But there's actually a way that other types of fleets, by optimizing their charging, can sort of help to free up, let's say, capacity on the grid that those trucks need. And it just reminds us of the fact that by putting into place, time-varying network tariffs, grid-based planning, efficiency, use of flexibility, and all these aspects that we've just discussed is really necessary to allow for each user, each EV charging, to use the grid sort of most cost efficiently and most beneficially.
Thank you, Julia. Again, I would like to turn now to Kai to give him the possibility, to answer or to give his feedback to what he just heard. Obviously, a lot of that is also in the realms of DG Ener, but yeah, maybe it's also interesting how DG Move and DG Ener are going to work together regarding grids, flexibility, tariffs.
well, Move obviously doesn't work on grids and network tariffs. I think this is fully under the competence of DG ENER. But we do work together on aspects related to charging and to smart charging, because, well, basically the recharging point is the connector between the mobility and the energy system. And this is basically where we actually need to have the smartness. This is where we actually want to control the charging through the recharging point, and that falls under AFIR. So this is basically where I think the two systems meet, and also where we meet in terms of hardware, but also in terms of communication. So here we basically cooperate, and seen in AFIR, we actually make smart recharging functionalities mandatory for all publicly accessible recharging points, RED then also for the private. So we're actually setting here the conditions so that smart charging is being enabled, and also then looking forwards also bi-directional charging. So I think, and here, I mean, some of you know that I worked before on the retail side of the electricity markets. So I fully agree, and I fully understand the enormous potential there is for demand response and the need for flexibility, not just for the transport sector, for all sectors. All flexibility that we can have needs to go into the market, and I think the transport sector is a very, very good sector to actually provide that flexibility. You have to see to which extent, who exactly. I mean, cars are the predominant load that comes into your mind, because they actually parked for 23 hours and they only need to charge like 15, 20 minutes per day. So you actually have a lot of flexibility to play with when you actually do the little charging. That is, of course, completely different for HDVs. Some of them are basically operating throughout the day and the night with 3 different drivers. They just are on the road 24 hours per day. So, I mean, there is very little flexibility, and every flexibility and the charging is completely planned in the schedule. Same applies basically also for public transport companies, where when you actually have a bus depot, you know exactly how long each bus parks, and then you basically know, okay, and 8 hours, and for these 8 hours, we actually do the charging. You actually want to be part in the flexibility. That means you reduce the time of charging for the vehicle, and your electricity connection to the depot has to be bigger actually than actually anticipated, because you might actually have to reduce the time you can actually charge and increase the power. So there are lots of things to consider also when actually planning, if you want to actually participate here, especially as a depot in any sort of flexibility, plan the network accordingly. So hugely important. I think what we want to do is to actually make sure it is working, also through the data we are working on under the Sustainable Transport Forum. We look into smart charging there. We actually define the use cases and define the data needs that needs to be actually exchanged between the different actors involved in the process. So here again, trying to actually help the sector and help to get a common understanding, and ultimately also common rules here for the charging. Of course, what is also needed, and I think that is also very clear from the letters to the Energy Commissioner, demand response needs to be enabled, and it needs to be payoff. I mean, nobody does smart charging for the climate. Well, if you do, but actually you do it because it actually pays off. There needs to be financial incentives to do so. So the energy system needs to reward the flexibility in the market. And I think still work needs to be done. But I think it's very clear that the Commission will actually have a specific focus on that in the next mandate.
All right, thanks a lot. Unfortunately, we do not have times to answer the 2 or 3 questions we had in the chat, but we could, of course, I think both questions were mostly asked to Koen, and I think it's possible for Kuhn to follow up on these questions if he agrees. So in the interest of time, we're just going to close the webinar now. And I want to thank all the speakers, all the participants, the audience, the European Commission, or Kai for being here. And I also want to remind everybody that next week, same time, same day, we will have our final webinar where we are going to focus on V2G technologies. And you should see you see now a QR code where you can register for this next webinar. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for being here, and have a nice day.